The Harbinger always went for the freaks. They were its favorite. It wanted ones that would fight back, and ones that wouldn't be afraid at first, or, even better, ones that believed they could win. Those rare humans with bravado and confidence so great that they actually believed they could defeat it somehow. Those were always the most pleasurable to kill. It loved watching the life fade from their defiant eyes as it slowly ripped them to shreds, watching as the realization that they were in fact powerless dawned on them. For centuries, this ancient creature had hunted down humans, whether for pleasure, sport, or because it was compelled to by instinct. It thrived on the death of the human race. However, it had long since grown tired of the predictable, frightened screams and wails of agony that often accompanied its various campaigns. As such, it had opted to change its prey demographic to the more interesting humans one might find among the masses. After all, Earth now had over 7 billion humans infesting its surface. Surely some of them would offer a more unique and exciting hunt than the thousands the Harbinger had culled before. That said, finding less predictable humans among millions of their more boring counterparts was like finding a needle in a haystack. Ever since the Harbinger had changed its modus operandi, it had become frustrated by the slower increase of its kill count. It had no idea which was worse, killing worthless, boring humans in droves, or spending weeks tracking down potentially interesting ones, sometimes only to find out that they just reacted as disappointingly as the rest. But then, the Harbinger found Adrian Bishop. At first, Adrian Bishop appeared to be yet another ordinary human with an ordinary life. He was a younger man of average height and build, with pitch black hair and a simple suit under a coat. The only thing about him that attracted the Harbinger's very selective attention was the fact that this man actually saw it. Normally, the Harbinger existed on a plane of existence above that of humans. Only when it wanted to reveal itself would they be able to witness its terrifying form. Yet, one morning as the Harbinger was prowling the streets of downtown Ottawa, a man stopped in his tracks and looked directly at it. The Harbinger, confused, looked behind itself, certain that the man had noticed something else and was just looking in its direction. Yet nothing noteworthy lingered there, while the man's gaze was pointed upward to meet the eyes of the 9-foot-tall monster. And then, Adrian Bishop did something completely unexpected, not panic or flee or even show a hint of fear. He simply smiled. It was a knowing, mischievous kind of smirk. If the hideously malformed face of the Harbinger could have made a surprised expression then, it most certainly would have. As if that wasn't strange enough, the man then simply looked away and began walking again as if nothing had happened. The Harbinger stood, looking all around for anything that might have caught the passerby's eye, but it seemed almost undeniable that the man had been looking directly at it. Needless to say, this warranted investigation. So, the Harbinger followed Adrian throughout his day. Unlike before, the man no longer paid it any attention, going about his daily business as usual. The Harbinger discovered that he worked at a local convenience store as a manager. From what it could tell, he was quite well liked by his employees and superiors, and had an almost painfully cheerful demeanor. The day passed by rather uneventfully, and the Harbinger grew bored. By the time Adrian started to head home, it was starting to suspect that the earlier incident had all been some kind of unlikely coincidence, and that Adrian hadn't seen him after all. Still, the interdimensional monstrosity didn't have anything better to do at the moment, so it decided to at least follow this human back to his house. As they arrived at the rather small flat, the Harbinger followed Adrian through a short hallway and into the living room. Adrian began taking off his coat while the Harbinger lingered in the hallway, glaring suspiciously at one particular locked door on the far end of the room. It felt something strange coming from that room, something unnatural yet familiar. "You can quit hiding over there, you know," Adrian's voice rang out, almost catching the creature off guard. "I apologize for keeping you waiting, but I'm afraid it was necessary to keep up appearances. Don't want people thinking." Before the human was even able to finish his sentence, the Harbinger was upon him, with a long, blade-like claw pressed against his throat and another huge hand clutching his head. Adrian didn't so much as flinch. "What is your true name?" the Harbinger demanded, its voice sounding like a whisper and a scream all at once. It seemed impossible to it that this human could see it. In its lifetime, it had come across humans who could sense it using somewhat of a sixth sense before, but never one who could actually lay eyes upon it while in the higher plane. Surely this was another dark being in disguise. "My name?" Adrian queried, the creature's firm grip not doing anything to deter his vaguely smug attitude. Adrian Bishop, human being extraordinaire." Growing frustrated, the Harbinger increased the strength of its grip. causing Adrian to wince. Ow, ow, easy there. You don't want to kill me, my friend. And why would I not? The Harbinger rasped. No human should be able to see the beings of the higher plane. You lie. Sorry, but I beg to differ, Adrian replied. I am aware that you and your kind possess a keen sense for the supernatural, right? So I ask, is there anything remotely inhuman about my being? As much as the Harbinger tried, the human was right. From what it could tell, the man currently held firmly in its clutches was nothing other than human. Were it any other sort of ethereal demon, the Harbinger should have been able to tell right away. How then? The Harbinger insisted. Has your science truly come this far? Adrian chuckled, even as the Harbinger's claw pressed harder against his soft flesh. No, of course not. I am as clueless as you are when it comes to the origin of my little gift, as it were. I've been able to see boogeymen like you since I was a child. In fact, I'm not even the only one who can. Though I assure you, it comes as no surprise to me that you aren't aware of our existence. Perceptive humans like me are quite a rare find, even today, when there are many more than there used to be. The Harbinger was still uncertain of this human. However, it couldn't deny the evidence before it. Even now, it was still concealed in a different layer of reality. Yet it was conversing with Adrian, as if it were on his level. The hideous features of its face contorted into what might have been interpreted as a look of disgust. The very idea of being unintentionally seen by a mere mortal was mortifying. Yet at the same time, it couldn't deny that Adrian Bishop appeared to be one of the most interesting humans it had come across in a very long time. Not once during this entire encounter had he even shown a hint of fear, as if he knew he wasn't going to die. While the Harbinger was extremely tempted to prove him wrong by skewering him now, it instead opted to wait and see what he would do. Part of the thrill was watching them squirm, after all. The Harbinger released its grip on Adrian, prompting a brief sigh from the man, not of relief but of exasperation. About time you came to your senses. You are an easily excitable one, aren't you, Harbinger? He turned around, actually looking at the monstrosity for the first time since that morning. And a handsome one, if I may say so. Do not tempt me, human, the Harbinger growled. Give me one sufficient reason to keep you alive for even a single second longer. Oh, I'll give you more than just one, Adrian said, that knowing smirk returning to his face. See, I know exactly why you're here. I understand your way of thinking more than most. You came here to kill me because you thought I was interesting, didn't you? The Harbinger remained silent. You thought I might put up a fight or try to resist. Make the hunt a little more interesting, right? Yes, I can see it in your eyes. We're kindred souls, you and I. The Harbinger scoffed, its bones cracking as it held its head up high. Do not be so impudent as to think you are like me. You are but a mere insect compared to— Yes, I know, that isn't how I meant it, Adrian interrupted, prompting an irritated growl from the monster before him. I'm just saying I'm tired of it too. The man turned around and began walking across the room to the locked door. You know what I mean. The paranoia that begins to set in when you stalk them. The fear they feel when they realize there's no escape. The frightened wails and screams when you're flaying them with your knife, or, I guess, claw in your case. It's all so overdone. Adrian brought out a keychain and unlocked the door, revealing a stairway leading down into darkness. After a while, you actually want some resistance. You want to stalk people who will have different reactions, ones who aren't so afraid in the beginning. Why, I'm sure you're itching to wipe this smug smile off my face right now. And that's exactly what I was counting on. The Harbinger narrowed its bulbous eye at Adrian as he flipped a light switch. If you come with me, I can give you exactly what you want, Harbinger. He turned around with a grin halfway deranged and devious plastered on his face. A good hunt, and with that he began descending down into the stairway. The Harbinger wasn't sure what to do. It felt extraordinarily tempted to kill this human and watch that overconfident demeanor melt away in his final moments. Yet it was intrigued, more intrigued than it had been in a long time, though he was human in body. Adrian Bishop appeared to be something entirely different in mind, something far closer to the Harbinger itself than any human it had met before. Ultimately, the choice was obvious. The monster followed after Adrian and began its descent down the stairs. I'm glad you decided to make the right choice, my friend, Adrian said. The room at the bottom of the stairs was surprisingly spacious for a basement, with a floor and walls made of stone-cold concrete. It was what painted them that was of particular interest. Strange, archaic symbols littered the surface of the room, drawn almost anywhere and everywhere possible in what appeared to be dried blood. The only place where they weren't drawn was in the very center of the room, where another larger circular symbol of a similar nature had been carved into the floor. An assortment of cabinets was set throughout the room, some of which contained books and files, while others were packed full of glass containers, vials, and bottles of substances. A long table was set against the right wall, on which were set a variety of tools ranging from saws and hammers to strange little devices that seemed to be designed for torture. By far the most intriguing part of the room, however, was the 2 cages at the far end. Each contained a person, a male and a female, sitting in the corners of their respective cages, cowering at the sight of Adrian Bishop. "Welcome to my humble abode, Harbinger. Feel free to make yourself at home." Taking a look around, the Harbinger recognized many of the symbols painted on the walls, though the one carved into the ground was completely unknown even to him. Regardless, he knew what this was. "So you are one of those humans foolish enough to dabble in the black arts? I should have expected no less," the Harbinger said. "Well, yes, though I like to think I do a little more than dabble," Adrian replied. He moved over to a swivel chair in the corner of the room and sat down. "I'm a bit of an aficionado when it comes to what people might refer to as sorcery. I've spent most of my life studying up, and I've even developed a few little charms and rituals of my own. It's not that hard if you know what you're doing, really." Turning the swivel chair around, he kicked the wall lightly, sending him rolling back. "I'm not really a wizard or anything. Rather, I think I'm more akin to a psychic than anything else. The black arts is just a really grimdark term to describe the various combinations of actions, words, and symbols which allow the human mind to tap into the power of this place you like to call the higher plane." He shrugged. "I can't claim to know how all of it works. That plane of existence is probably completely incomprehensible to us lowly humans. Frankly, I think a lot of the procedures you need to go through to cast curses and spells are ridiculously convoluted and cliché. But hey, what can you do?" The Harbinger was growing impatient. "What is your point?" "Well, you were wondering why I can see and hear you, right? It's just that some humans have much greater latent psychic potential than others," Adrian explained, his chair coming to a stop as it swerved around to face the Harbinger. "And I happen to be one of them. We're called seers, a term I coined, by the way. We have a strong connection to the higher plane, which allows us to be able to perceive its residents, among other things. In fact, not to brag, but out of all the seers I've met, I am probably the most gifted. It allows me to perform incantations and rituals that most could probably never do." The Harbinger scoffed, turning its attention to the 2 cowering humans in cages. They were almost completely naked, wearing only ragged underwear, and the rest of their bodies were covered in bloody bandages. They had both had their hands cupped over their faces, as if doing so would hide them from their captor. "Are you sure you are not simply what humans refer to as a psychopath?" the Harbinger sneered. Adrian chuckled in amusement, following its line of sight to the 2 captives. "I don't know, probably. Though I think I'm a tad more ambitious than the average psychopath, to be honest," he said. "As for these 2, they aren't here to be killed. They're more like my lab rats." The Harbinger observed the so-called lab rats for a moment longer. From what it could tell, they seemed utterly psychologically destroyed, as they did little more than rock back and forth or mutter while sitting huddled in the corners of their prisons. "I have not seen depravity such as this from your kind in many decades," the Harbinger said, though for once it was more of a compliment than an insult. Its long, bony finger pointed in the direction of a cabinet filled with narcotics. "I imagine that is what those are for, then. Very perceptive of you," Adrian chirped, growing more enthusiastic. "At first they were just another couple of toys to be played with and discarded, but I confess, I grew a little too attached to them. The 2 of them were rather resistant, after all. The woman managed to hold out for a whole week before pleading for it to stop, you know. That is quite rare. And when the man noticed I had started following him, he actually tried to stab me. Honestly, I admired their willpower so much that I couldn't let them go to waste. So I decided to try some of my experiments regarding true fear on them. You would be amazed what a combination of hallucinatory drugs, some simple fear induction incantations, and just a smidgen of physical torture can." "Enough of your talk," the Harbinger snapped. "I grow bored. Where is this hunt you promised me?" "Oh, right. My apologies, I don't get a chance to talk about my hobbies very often," Adrian said, scratching the back of his head nonchalantly. He pushed his feet against the ground, sending the chair rolling back before colliding with the cage of the woman. Her whole body froze as she briefly glanced up at him, before she curled up into a ball. Adrian crossed his legs, staring intently at the Harbinger. "Now then, let's get down to business. My proposition is simple enough. I'm offering to become your supplier. I take it you've been having trouble finding humans worthy to hunt, right? Well, worry no more. I know where you can find them, plenty of them." Again, Adrian turned around and pushed against the bars of the cage, sending the chair rolling toward one of the cabinets. Using a hand to stop himself, he pried open one of the drawers, revealing a laptop. "Marvelous invention. The internet," he continued as he booted it up. "It allows you to get in touch with people from around the globe. Not only that, but I think you'll find that people are much more interesting under the veil of anonymity. Without judgmental old society glaring over their shoulder, they're free to say whatever they want. It makes it an awful lot easier to identify the potential hunts." Adrian began tapping away at the keyboard as he spoke. "Over the years I've spent a long time trying to find people who might be interesting. And I don't just mean resilient people. I mean people like me, people who've seen what I've seen. Seers. It took quite some time considering how rare they are, combined with the heaps of fakes and charlatans out there. But I developed a way for seers to reliably identify one another, and I got us to band together. Now I run an entire online community full of users who are seers. It's strictly invitation only, of course. Some are more psychically gifted than others, but they can all at least see monsters. Because of that, I can guarantee that none of them have lived a normal life, or could be defined as normal people." The Harbinger was speechless. If what Adrian was saying was true, it had just stumbled across the greatest opportunity in centuries. It was almost too good to be true. And because of that, the Harbinger wasn't about to believe him right away. "Nonsense," it replied. "As if that little device could be used to amass so many people." Adrian sighed and shook his head. "Come on, Harbinger, don't be an old geezer. You know as well as I do it's perfectly possible. It was through this website and the people in it that I first became aware of you after all." The Harbinger perked up at this. "Is that so?" Adrian nodded. Yes, it is. I was just logging on now so I could prove it to you. If I remember right, I was first informed about you by a user who actually observed you for a time while you were in New York. They watched you stalk a kid named, hang on." Adrian moved his finger across the touchpad and tapped it a few times. "Here we go. It was a girl named Lucy Wilder, 16 years old, lived in Brooklyn, had a scar on one of her eyebrows. You killed her back in. Ring any bells?" The Harbinger thought for a moment, before realizing it did remember killing a young girl with a scar on her eyebrow a few years ago. "That hunt was substandard," it commented. It seriously doubted that Adrian could have found this out on his own. He must have been telling the truth. "That's unfortunate. I do find that teenagers are some of the most easily frightened aside from small children," Adrian said, closing the laptop. "So then, am I right in assuming you believe me now?" The Harbinger was willing to believe that this claim of a seer network was true, but something was still off about the entire deal. "You plan to sell out the people that you spent so long gathering. Why? Are they not your ilk?" Adrian was silent for a moment, looking at the Harbinger numbly before he suddenly burst out laughing. "Ha! Wahahaha! My ilk? You must be joking!" he boomed, prompting more frightened shivers from the humans in the cages. Calming down, he continued. "Come along, Harbinger. Surely you must see by now I'm nothing like these other humans. You think I feel some sort of attachment to these people? They're merely more playthings to be toyed with, that's all. I gathered them for a very specific purpose, in fact, which is why I need your help eliminating them." "And what would that purpose be?" the Harbinger asked. "Well, experimentation, of course, but not like what you've seen with these people. I plan to conduct a whole new kind of experiment, for which I specifically need seers," Adrian explained. "The problem is, none of the seers actually live nearby. They're dispersed throughout the world, and I can't get to them easily, even with the black arts on my side. But you can. I will not capture them for you and bring them back," the Harbinger growled. "I will not be your slave." "Come now, don't take me for a fool, I know that," Adrian replied. "The experiment I want to perform actually involves a ritual. I don't necessarily need to be there to activate it. It's just that the mechanism requires a particularly gifted individual as the sacrifice. All I'd need you to do is set the ritual up as per my instructions each time, and kill your victim in the ritual setting, after you've had your fun, of course. The instructions will be different each time, as I try out different variants of this ritual, since it's custom-made." The Harbinger grew somewhat suspicious as it listened to Adrian's explanation. "What is this ritual you speak of?" "Well, that's an interesting question. You see, it involves the combination of a series of ancient incantations passed down through my family for generations, combined with some basic trigger runes, a type spell circ." What is its purpose? The Harbinger impatiently interrupted. Right, sorry, rambling. Basically, I want to reanimate the dead. The Harbinger let out a chuckle at this. Ah, you humans never cease to amuse me. Your televisions have lied to you. The undead do not exist. It is impossible to reanimate a corpse after its soul is gone. Ah, I know, but I don't intend to let the soul leave its body, Adrian excitedly proclaimed. Without going into too much detail, the idea is to trap the soul inside the dead body using the brain's psychic energy. The high psychic potential of seers should make it possible to contain the soul even after death, since the brain doesn't immediately cease functioning. Then the incantation you recite should stir the trapped soul, causing it to reanimate the body. In theory, the Harbinger was sure that this foolish theory was nonsense, but the man seemed completely confident in his abilities. And it was none of the creature's business whether the rituals succeeded or failed. All that mattered to it were the hunts which were being promised. It seems like a fair exchange, doesn't it? Adrian said, looking up at the Harbinger. All you have to do is a bit of handiwork after your hunt is finished. You can spend as much time psychologically decimating the person as you like, but once the time comes to finish them off, I simply ask that you kill them, according to my instructions. And believe me, the hunts will be well worth your while. The Harbinger stared down at the seated man. The offer was too tempting to resist. At this point, there was no way it could refuse. As much as it still desired to kill Adrian, it would be foolish not to take advantage of his offer first. Then, after Adrian ran out of victims to supply, his number would be up, and the Harbinger would claim its ultimate reward, that smug grin of his. The Harbinger made a quick, jerky movement with its head that resembled a nod. We are in agreement, Adrian Bishop. And so the partnership between monster and man began. Abby logged in. Abby, I made the deal. TR, oh god, RW video footage? AB, I've emailed it to all of you. GP, holy shit, I'm so excited. TR, excited? I'm fucking terrified. Abby, fear of death will do that to you, my friend. RW, saw the footage. It really is happening then, isn't it? RW, finally our lives will completely turn. Around RW, I thought I'd be excited when this happened, or terrified, but I'm not really sure what to feel, RW, it's just happening. Abba, I understand, Roland. I feel the same way. But if all goes according to plan, it won't be too long. Abby, as you know, it won't happen right away. I'm having the Harbinger deal with some bottom feeders before I set him on you. This serves the dual purpose of gaining the Harbinger's trust and performing some last-minute tests with the ritual. TR, those test subjects of yours won't rise up for long, right? AB, of course. I've mixed in limitation runes with the symbolic formula to make sure that the subject will die after a few seconds. As long as they rise up at all, we'll know it was a success. Then I simply remove the limiters when our time comes, and voila. RW, I know it's a little late to be saying this, but RW, are you sure this will work? RW, I mean, will it really believe that bullshit about making zombies? AB, it does not care what my goal is with these rituals, as long as it gets an entertaining hunt. AB, you see, creatures such as the Harbinger may seem devilish and cunning on the surface, but really they are quite simple-minded. Most of their prowess as hunters comes from their instinct rather than strategic thinking. AB, that, combined with its borderline god complex, makes it so that it would never even entertain the possibility of being outsmarted by a lowly human. AB, I could go on about the psychology of such creatures if you wish. TR, no. GP, no offense, Adrian, but please spare us another one of your lectures. AB, sorry, I thought it might make Roland feel better. RW, I suppose you're right. Abby, just make sure you have your axe ready. If the Harbinger gets bored with hunting you, the whole plan could fall apart. Abby, you are all the most powerful seers I have come to know these few years. I trust that won't be too much of an issue, correct? TR, course not. GP, fuck yeah. RW, yes, I suppose so. Abby, excellent. Abby, with your cooperation, it won't be long before we all ascend. The following months were filled with bloodshed. Though it had initially been skeptical, the Harbinger soon began to realize that Adrian's claims were entirely true. Its first victims were what its benefactor described as monster hunters, those who use the black arts to target monsters and either kill or seal them away. Personally, I find those people to be fools, Adrian had complained. They believe they're righteous warriors of justice, saving the world from evil one monster at a time, or some nonsense. Ha! In reality, they're little more than pest control. They only have enough power to put down the most inferior and feeble-minded of beings, and barely enough to seal away some of those on a higher level. None of them could ever hope to defeat a monster such as yourself, but believe me, they will try. Many of them have died doing so. Each of the hunters provided more entertainment than the Harbinger had in years. Most operated on their own, but those who were in close proximity to one another actually banded together to engage in their little hobby. Some of them were intimidated when faced with the challenge that was the Harbinger, but having been approached by creatures of the unknown many times before, they did their best to use their weak incantations and rituals to get rid of it. Some of the less experienced ones, who couldn't have known how much of a threat it really was, even went as far as to taunt and threaten the beast. It was all quite amusing, watching the insects and their false sense of grandeur fall apart as the Harbinger haunted them day and night. To perform the rituals, it would wait until night fell to take its victim to a deserted building such as an abandoned warehouse. Adrian requested that a video camera be set up so that he could observe, which was no easy task for the Harbinger's long, clawed hands. All of the rituals were highly complex, requiring overly specific procedures to perform. It needed to carve a particular series of symbols and runes into the walls in a particular order, facing a particular direction, and at a particular time of night. What was even more convoluted were the necessary actions. During one ritual, the Harbinger was required to move 2 steps back, stab the victim in both of their legs, move 2 steps forward, and scratch their eyes out. Then it would wait for 5 seconds before biting the victim's nose off, and leaving them to bleed out. Considering how much these procedures caused the victim's suffering, the Harbinger had no issues with performing them, and actually enjoyed it to a degree. Though one strange commonality that all of the rituals had was the final procedure. The Harbinger would carve a symbol identical to the unknown one in Adrian's basement, and simply stand in its center. Then, it would recite the same incantation 13 times before killing the victim and allowing their blood to pool into the symbol. After this, it would wait several minutes to see if the dead human revived, but never once did the ritual succeed. The Harbinger brought this up with Adrian one day after its 10th kill. Your primitive little rituals do not appear to be succeeding. Do you still truly believe that the dead can be brought back to life? Theoretically, everything checks out, Adrian said, frowning as he looked over a diagram featuring a strange pentagram-like symbol. Honestly, I don't know why this is happening. Maybe the seer's mental energy just isn't powerful enough? The Harbinger was well aware that the problem was probably more fundamental than that. It did not know a great deal about the black arts after all. It was already a being with a powerful connection to the higher plane, and thus had no need for them. But over the centuries, it had managed to pick up a few of the basics of sorcery, and after remembering some of that trivial knowledge, it realized that there were a few faults in the procedures Adrian had been performing. The way he was arranging the symbols and runes, they were geared to perform the basic function of displacing energy, which was probably just causing the victim's psychic power to be sapped away before it could be used to trap the soul. Although it was somewhat confused by the contradictory nature of Adrian's ritual, it did not say anything. The Harbinger realized that the reason Adrian had made a deal with it was in order to test this ritual, which meant that as long as the ritual needed to be improved, the arrangement would continue. Thus it resolved to allow Adrian to continue his foolish escapade until either he figured the problem out on his own, or the Harbinger grew tired of his hunts. Ideally, he wouldn't figure it out until it wanted him to, at which point his ritual would be a success, and his ego would be at an all-time high. That would be the perfect time to bring about his ultimate downfall. Satisfied with its little scheme, the monster continued to humor the man. Is there no way to gauge a seer's mental capacity? Yes, it should be possible to judge how strong someone's psychic connection is based on the level of the incantations they can perform, Adrian replied. But that doesn't mean I know everyone's psychic potential. I can't force everyone on my site to undergo a test. That said, the ones I've been sending you after are, to my knowledge, relatively weak. I've been saving the bigger fish for later, since I'm sure neither of us wants to waste those too early on. The Harbinger perked up at this. It watched Adrian roll from one side of the room to the other in his swivel chair as he picked up another diagram. And why would you assume that of me? It asked. It makes no difference to me what my victim's psychic potential is. Oh, but it does, Harby. Adrian was quick to respond, putting down his diagram and looking up at the being. Mind if I call you Harby? The Harbinger took a long step forward, growling as it glared down at him. Do not tempt me, human. Adrian chuckled. What is that? Your catchphrase or something? He teased. As much as the harbinger wanted to skewer one of his legs on the spot, it restrained itself. The sense of safety the man was beginning to feel around it would only serve to make his death all the more delicious. Anyway, do you remember the day we met, when you mentioned that I might be a psychopath? I did a little research on the subject, and I discovered that I actually fit the bill quite nicely. But for that matter, so do a few of my friends. He picked up a Rubik's Cube and began to fiddle with it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the more powerful seers were all quite similar in disposition to. Publisher's note: if you enjoy this story, the author encourages you to read its companion piece, Sniff. My first job was at a 24-hour restaurant called Flavi's on 3rd and Burlington in Westlake. It was a real hole-in-the-wall place, the type where patrons line up beneath the menu board, specializing in burgers, gyros, and all-day, grease-heavy breakfast. I worked graveyard shifts. So did most of my customers, the medical crowd. There were 2 middle-sized hospitals nearby, cops, firefighters, and the assorted civil servants that filtered in and out of the neighborhood. A middle-aged LAPD officer used to come by, sometimes with a partner, sometimes alone. Let's call him Officer Carlos Nunez. Officer Nunez didn't look like a cop. If I'd seen him at the grocery store, I'd have thought he were a professor or an attorney or a realtor. He had a square jaw and high forehead, curly brown hair, an endearing bald spot, and the friendly diplomatic face of a sitcom dad. Officer Nunez had stories. On lazy nights he could entertain his audience for hours, that audience consisting of Eagle Scout-looking fire babies, bored security guards, and nursing students off clinical shifts. 30 years with a badge and a car had given him plenty of material. When there were no kiddies to impress, he talked to me. Some of his stories were pretty dark. He saved those stories for the coldest, windiest nights when Flavi's was empty, save for him and me and the cooks. Though it was nearly a decade ago, what he told me on one of those nights still lingers in the back of my mind. There's a building, he'd started, less than a mile from here, near 6th and Alvarado. It was abandoned, repossessed by the bank. They should have bulldozed the dump. It had been low-income housing, the Primrose Apartments. Originally office space, the building was bought at auction in 1999, gutted, and divided into cheap little white-walled units where the roofs leaked and the air conditioning never worked. In the early 2000s, Nunez was dispatched to the Primrose every couple weeks, for the reasons one would expect. Domestic disturbances, possession with intent to sell, drunken brawls in the parking lot, solicitation, truancy, noise complaints. Nothing out of the ordinary for a public housing complex lodged within the bowels of a major city. Yet somehow, embarrassingly, the building played on his nerves. I never liked the place, he told me. It was creepy. No building erected in the 70s has the right to be as creepy as that one. If he'd been asked to put a finger on the epicenter of this innate creepiness, he'd have pointed to a little closet on the first floor. The way he described it was, coming from the back entrance, which only employees and cops ever used, a left turn would take you to a set of double doors, through which the elevator lobby and the leasing office were accessible. A right turn lead down a narrow hallway, past the janitor's storage, to a dead end. The little closet in question was opposite the janitor's. The door was unlabeled, innocuous, and should have functioned as glorified wallpaper. But for Nunez, who'd stumbled upon the closet while looking for a restroom, even a glance towards it filled him with irrational dread. A funny smell lingered about the door. He'd catch a faint tendril of the stench every time he walked through the back door. One night, Nunez and his partner, a lady cop who went by Rusty, were dispatched to the Primrose to investigate a domestic disturbance, a man threatening his girlfriend with a butcher knife. They found the woman locked in the bathroom and the boyfriend pounding on the door. Let's call the woman Marisol and the man Modesto. Nunez and Rusty managed to cajole the pair into cooperating. Rusty stayed in the bathroom with Marisol. Nunez sat in the kitchen with Modesto. Modesto claimed that Marisol was cheating on him with her ex-husband. He'd seen the ex hanging around the elevator lobby. When quizzed on the subject, Marisol insisted Modesto was crazy. Yes, she was still friendly with her ex-husband, but it was solely for the sake of their son. She had no desire to sleep with him. And besides, the ex-husband lived in Washington. It was suggested that Modesto had seen a man who resembled Marisol's ex. He got defensive. He strode into Marisol's son's room and came out with a framed picture, the son with his arm around a taller, better-looking man. "I gotta see this shit every day," he ranted to Nunez. "You don't think I'd recognize this asshole if I saw him?" It took a while, but Modesto calmed down and admitted he may have been mistaken. Marisol didn't want to press charges, and the couple was left in peace. 2 weeks later, Nunez and Rusty were called to the same apartment for the same reason. This time, Marisol was barricaded in the master bedroom, and Modesto was brandishing a tire iron, insisting he'd had an enraging conversation with her ex-husband in the lobby. "You fucked him," he screamed. "He told me. He said you fucked him on our fucking bed." Backup was called. 30 minutes later, Modesto was cuffed, sobbing, to a chair, while Marisol tearfully paced, on the phone with the ex-husband, trying to prove he hadn't been hanging out in the lobby of the Primrose. "There!" she cried finally. Triumphantly, she'd pulled up a picture on her phone and shoved it in Modesto's face. She handed the phone to Nunez. It was of the man from the picture, her ex-husband, standing by a City of Wenatchee Street sign, holding a copy of the Wenatchee World with the day's date. No way he flew here, fucked me, then flew back to Washington in time to take this picture. Modesto was asked to elaborate. Maybe he was the butt of a cruel trick. He said he'd been alone in the elevator lobby, checking his mail. The ex-husband stealthily came up beside him and had described in graphic, excruciating detail what he and Marisol had done while Modesto was at work. This time, Modesto was more difficult to pacify. He'd been suspicious for months, he told the cops. He knew the ex-husband had attempted to reconcile with Marisol. He was uncomfortable with their amicable relationship, and it didn't help that Marisol used her ex to stroke Modesto's jealousy. She'd call him whenever the two of them got into a fight, and constantly talked about how good a father and provider he was. Finally, they came to a resolution. Modesto went to stay with his brother. Marisol agreed to lock the doors, and a police car was dispatched to the neighborhood in case the ex-husband reappeared or Modesto got cute. Nunez didn't know what to make of the two of them. Modesto was obviously paranoid, but his fury and grief had been sincere. Marisol may have used her ex-husband to make her current beau jealous, but she'd seemed legitimately mystified by his accusations of infidelity. And Nunez highly doubted the ex-husband would have hopped a plane to Los Angeles just to fuck his ex-wife and stick it to her new boyfriend. And then, there was the man in the elevator lobby. The man who might have been in the elevator lobby. Nunez and Rusty passed him on the way back to their squad car. A man, leaning against the wall, face buried in a newspaper. Nunez saw the man and registered what he was seeing, but it took his subconscious a minute to process the information. Then realization of what he'd seen, and its implications, hit him like a ton of bricks, and he'd ran, back through the back entrance, back through the double doors. But the man was gone, and Nunez was left to wonder whether or not it had all been his imagination, because he could swear the man had been reading a copy of the Wenatchee World. Next, Nunez detailed an incident involving a middle-aged Bible thumper he called Dolores. Dolores lived on the second floor of the Primrose Apartments. She was a sweet lady, but painfully high-strung. At least once a week the cops were summoned to her humble abode. She heard a noise after midnight? Call the cops. Two suspicious-looking men talking in the parking lot? Call the cops. Her son's out 5 minutes past curfew? Call the cops. It had gotten to the point where the dispatchers recognized her voice. Nunez had been sent to calm her down more than once. He believed that truly, Dolores just needed someone to talk to. And she talked a lot. She talked about her blackout drunk past, about her husband who had fled, in the dead of night, with the shoebox full of cash she'd been saving for her kids to go to college, never to be seen or heard from again. She told him about how she'd found Jesus and how she wished her meth-addicted daughter would come home. The daughter had been in Bakersfield last she'd heard, shacking up with the boyfriend du jour and 3 months pregnant. But that had been 2 years ago, and now her number was disconnected and her mail got sent back, and all Dolores could do was pray for her grandchild. She talked about her son, Michael. He was 17 and a senior in high school. Michael was a good boy, she insisted, but she didn't like his friends. They were a bad influence on him. And lately, he'd been avoiding her calls and coming home late. He was surlier, angrier, and his clothes smelled like marijuana. He swore the pot smell had come from his friend's car. But Dolores was scared. She thought he was doing drugs. "I can't lose him," she'd sobbed to Nunez, as he tried to convince her that the car stalling in the parking lot wasn't indicative of a drug deal. "Mikey is all I have left." One September day, Nunez and Rusty were, yet again, dispatched to Dolores's apartment. He was more frustrated than concerned. They'd had a rough morning, and he wasn't in the mood to take notes on the explosion read. Upstairs neighbor dropped a pot, and lid Dolores had heard, or nod and through one of her long-winded tales of motherly woe. But according to the dispatcher, this time was different. Dolores, who usually took an assertive and condescending tone, had been screaming and crying. It was her son. He was hurt. The paramedics were 15 minutes away. Dolores answered the door howling. Her prematurely wrinkled face was streaked with tears. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her hair stuck out where she'd pulled at it, and she was sobbing so violently she could barely speak. "Michael," she panted, pointing towards a closed door. "Michael, he's," she screamed. Primal, animalistic, she cried out to the sky and collapsed on the floor, burying her tear-stained face in her knees. Even thinking about it, Nunez told me, was enough to make him tear up. All the pain and despair in the world was captured in that scream. Rusty tried to comfort Dolores. Nunez, hand on his gun, opened the door. The smell hit him immediately. Musty, like a basement after a rainstorm, mixed with something sweeter, the potpourri his mother had kept in a bowl. He breathed through his mouth. He flipped the light switch, a teenaged boy's room. In the far corner, a mattress with bedding kicked aside. On the mattress, a young man, no older than 18, was propped up against the wall. His head hung down, jaundiced blue eyes still open. Skinny, anorexic, purple blood pooling under waxen skin. Stringy red hair, blotched, infected track marks oozing pus, joints stiff and contracted, swollen tongue lolling. Nunez buckled. He might have cried out. Trembling like a dog, he knelt by the boy. Given the dullness of the sunken cheeks and the violet hue of the flaccid limbs, he hypothesized the kid had been dead for hours, if not a day. Overdose. Slipping on a pair of latex gloves, holding his breath, he reached for the corpse's face. The glassy doll's eyes were too much to bear. If he closed them, his head would stop spinning, and his hands would stop shaking, and he could function like an officer of the law, as opposed to a squeamish little. A hand clasped his arm. An icy, vice-strong claw grasped his arm. It took him a twisting, maddening second to realize what was happening. Michael's cold, dead, decomposing Michael's cyanotic fingers were wrapped around his wrist. Nunez fell backwards. Michael sat up straight, folded, turned his torso. His stiff, angular joints jerked mechanically, grotesquely. His tarnished plastic eyes stared lifelessly ahead. Then the jaw moved, jostling the swollen, languid tongue. And with no respect for mechanics or anatomy, he spoke. "Officer Nunez," a monotonous, alien mockery of a human voice. "This will all burn. You will burn with it." Nunez grunted, kicked, tugged, broke free of the creature's grip. He twisted onto his hands and knees. He stumbled to the door, turned the knob, and fell into the living room, slamming the door behind him. Dolores was curled on the couch, sobbing quietly. Rusty stood in the doorway, waving to the paramedics, who were making their way down the hallway with their gurney. "The boy. He's not," Nunez stammered. Rusty turned to him, then snapped her head back towards the hallway. "What the fuck?" A paramedic pushed past her into the apartment. On his heels was a teenaged boy with longish red hair and blue eyes, dressed in khakis and a NWA sweatshirt, looking quite confused. It was Michael. Michael, very much alive. Dolores screamed. In one movement she threw herself onto her son, collapsing with him to the dirty shag carpet, clutching him in a suffocating embrace. Rusty gave Nunez a look. The paramedic rolled his eyes. "Dying boy found walking upstairs to his mother's apartment," he said sarcastically. "Please tell me he's got an identical twin." It was a miracle Nunez held onto his shit, looking at Michael, healthy, breathing Michael. Cradled in his mother's arms, he had never been so scared of a human being in his entire life. "There's a corpse," he managed to force out. Eager to establish some context to the zombie movie jump scare he'd just experienced, Nunez grasped the doorknob with his right hand to pull himself up. Searing pain tore down his arm. He fell to his knees, groaning. The paramedic pushed past him, opened the door, looked in, and snorted. "There's nothing here." Nunez managed to rise to his feet. He and Rusty peered into Michael's room. There was nothing. The mattress, save a bunched-up comforter and sheets, was unoccupied. No blood, no excrements. Just an empty teenager's bedroom. He did a lap of the room just to make sure. He shook out the comforter, dug through a hamper of dirty clothes, threw open the closet door. Nothing. No remnants of the atrophied, decomposing corpse that had threatened Nunez with fire. He sniffed the air. The musty potpourri smell still hung in the air, but it was fainter now, dissipated, despite the tightly closed window. Dolores, giddily happy, concluded she must have imagined seeing her son's dead body. She didn't do any drugs, no sir. Clean for 12 years, but had been under a lot of psychological stress, and lay awake nights, haunted by visions of her only remaining child repeating her youthful mistakes. That, with the heat and the smog, it was enough to make anyone hallucinate. I saw the same thing she did, Nunez remembered saying. Michael sprawled dead on his mattress. At that, Dolores had frowned. What are you talking about, sprawled? I found him hanging in his closet. Nunez couldn't get out of there fast enough. It was weird, Rusty said, but not completely inconceivable. Dolores was delusional. Nunez had been overly susceptible to the power of suggestion and had imagined seeing a corpse because Dolores said there was a corpse-induced psychotic disorder. I don't know, she told him. If you're really seeing things, maybe you should take some time off. Go see the department shrink. Nunez had passed on the shrink, no use having someone else tell him he was crazy. But, as it turned out, the time off was involuntary. He woke up the next morning with his right wrist ballooning. Dislocation fracture. I must have fallen on it, he lied. No attention was paid to the 5 purple bruises around his wrist, so much like the prints of 5 strong clutching fingers. Nunez told his final tragic tale of the Primrose Apartments, as though it had been a dream, testimony knotted together with conjecture and hearsay. He was on medical leave for 2 months while his arm healed. When he returned to the station, he was greeted with whispers and pitying stares. Rusty, bless her heart, had stood up for him, telling their superiors the incident with Michael and Dolores was a non-issue, a side effect of overwork. But he guessed the paramedic team had told everyone he was losing it. Luckily for him, he wasn't the only guy on the force rubbed the wrong way by the Primrose Apartments. In fact, even the tenants of the Primrose Apartments seemed put off by the place. According to Officer Otanon, a desk cop that knew everything about everyone, families were jumping ship like rats before a storm. They can't keep it filled, he'd said to Nunez over the water cooler. They're at about half capacity now, and that's with subsidies from the county. No one can stay there for long, save the druggies who've already fried their brains. There's a rumor the building's haunted. Others sought him out as well, usually in secluded spaces, always requiring multiple assurances that, as far as top brass was concerned, the conversation did not happen. They'd been to the Primrose Apartments. They'd seen stuff. It's always the users and the drunks, Officer Anderson murmured excitedly. Always the same thing. They call us flipping shit because they see some dead family member in the kitchen, or the fucking elevator, or staring down at them from the ceiling. If it were one, I wouldn't be too worried. But it's one every week, always at that god-forsaken dump. I think I'm going crazy, Officer Liu told him late one night, after everyone else had left. Some old lady called us down there, because she was convinced her neighbor was stealing from her. Total bullshit. We found her missing antique vase in the closet, right where she'd hid it from the home care nurse, who she also thought was stealing. You know the type. Anyways, I finished up with her, and my partner said she was going to the car, but when I stepped out into the hallway, she was waiting there. We took the elevator down. On the first floor I stepped out, she didn't follow me. I looked back, and she wasn't in the elevator at all. She just disappeared. This chill came over me, and I ran like a rabbit. I ran back to the car, and guess who I found sitting shotgun, talking on the phone to dispatch? My partner. I asked her how she got there so fast. She looked at me weird. She said she'd never gone back into the building. Dispatch had requested a landline. She'd been in the car, on the phone, the whole time. If you don't mind me asking, Nunez said, what did the two of you talk about on the elevator? That's the thing, Officer Liu replied. On the elevator, she'd asked me what I thought the point of life was. We're never really fulfilled, and then we die, and it's like we never existed. It was the most depressing conversation I've ever had. I swear, it messed me up for weeks. And I noticed this weird smell, like a wet basement mixed with potpourri. Yeah, Officer Liu said. I'd say weed and mold, but that works too. Then Nunez learned about little Thaddeus Wheeler. Thad was 12 years old. He lived on the 4th floor of the Primrose Apartments with his mom, 2 little brothers, half-sister and niece. Sad story. His mother worked as a CNA at St. Vincent, nights. Thad's father had been in the ground for 3 years, shot in the driveway of the house where the family had once lived, likely the victim of a gang initiation. There were photos of him with the kids all over the apartment. Little Thad had been a good student, a good kid, a talented artist, talented enough to make a difference, had been. Lately, his teacher had reported that Thad was falling asleep in class and falling behind on his work. He ignored his friends and family. While his brothers played video games or rode bikes in the parking lot, Thad would lock himself in his room. His drawings, once of animals and fantasy creatures, had become much darker, scary things with sharp claws and teeth. Once, a month before, Lydia Wheeler, the mother, called in a panic. When she'd arrived home at Thad was missing. 3 sets of cops were dispatched to search the premises. They found the boy an hour later, fast asleep in a little closet. Right across from the janitor's closet? Nunez asked, dreading the answer. Yeah, the other officer said, frowning. How'd you know? When asked why he did it, Thad responded that he simply liked it there. Sleepwalking, everyone thought. But the police had been called to Lydia Wheeler's apartment twice more since then. Once, by Lydia, because Thad was hitting his head against the wall and wouldn't stop. And once, by a neighbor, because Thad was wandering aimlessly through the halls, clutching a serrated steak knife. Lydia told the cops that Thad's nighttime sojourns to the little closet on the first floor had become a recurring incident. 3 times a week she would find him there, asleep on the dirty linoleum floor. She was looking for a therapist. The next time Thaddeus Wheeler inspired a call, by the sister, Rochelle, this time, Nunez and Rusty were one of the 2 pairs sent. 12-year-old African-American male, the dispatcher had said, locked in a bedroom, armed with a knife, possibly a second person with him. Nunez and Rusty met Rochelle, a chubby girl of about 19, in the hallway outside of the apartment. A toddler and 2 school-aged boys huddled at her feet. There's a man in there, Rochelle cried. I went to the door to call Thad for dinner and I heard him talking to someone. This deep man's voice responded. Then Thad started screaming, no, 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 and something slammed against the wall. I tried to force the door, but it's locked and I think there's something pushed against it. Did you hear what the man said to Thad? Rusty asked calmly. Rochelle shook her head. I think I'm going crazy. I couldn't make out what he said, but it sounded like, I don't know. It's bullshit. What? Rusty asked. I thought he sounded like my stepfather, but my stepfather's been dead for years. Rusty herded Rochelle and the children towards the elevator. Guns drawn, Nunez and the other 2 officers entered the apartment. From one of the rooms, they heard a child crying. Coming up on the closed door, Nunez and the second cop positioned themselves. The burliest of the 3 turned his shoulder, took a running start, and rammed the door. Bang! The door slid open. A nightstand had been placed against it. Nunez nearly dropped his gun in shock. The must and potpourri smell hit him in the face like a wave. Little Thad sat on the floor between 2 sets of bunk beds, clad in a wife-beater and boxer shorts, holding a steak knife. Up and down his arms and legs were deep, jagged, self-inflicted cuts. His face was swollen and snotty. Upon seeing the 2 guns pointed at him, he dropped the knife and let out a small cry. We're not going to hurt you, kid, Nunez heard himself say. The room was completely trashed. There were pictures on the walls, horrible demons, mutilated humans and animals, flames, torture implements. Upon closer inspection, the drawings were determined to have been completed with both marker and Thad's blood. The paramedics and the Department of Mental Health were called. The apartment was thoroughly searched for the esoteric second party, the man with the deep voice. No one was found. Nunez and Rusty approached little Thad as he sat shivering on a gurney, the paramedic bandaging his arms. Hey buddy, Nunez said amicably. I'm Officer Carlos. Do you mind if we ask you a few questions? Thad shrugged. Okay. Your sister told us she heard you talking to someone in your room. Can you tell us who? Thad stared. You're not going to get them in trouble, buddy. We just want to talk to them, make sure they're okay. We're not going to arrest them or anything. You can't arrest him, Thad said. He's not human. Oh? Nunez responded. Is he a ghost? He's my dad. He's dead. He died, and the angels sent him to hell. He comes and sees me at night. He tells me what to do so me and my family don't have to go to hell with him when we die. Oh, what does he tell you to do? Thad shook his head. He says I have to draw demons every day, and whenever I have a bad thought, I have to hurt myself. The DMH lady came back then, handing a detainment form to the paramedics. The paramedics lifted the gurney into the ambulance. Rusty stayed back to talk to them. Nunez, brain buzzing, went to start his report. The druggies see their dead family members. That's what Officer Anderson had said. Officer Liu had spoken to his partner, while his partner was in the squad car talking to dispatch. He'd seen Michael's corpse reanimate and assault him. Dolores had seen Michael's corpse hanging in the closet. Michael was alive. Modesto had seen Marisol's ex-husband. The ex-husband was in Washington. Rochelle had heard Thad's father's voice. Thad said his dead father came and visited him. What the heck was going on in that apartment building? The next time Nunez was dispatched to the Primrose was the last. It was some old neighbor lady. He couldn't have said which one. There weren't many tenants left. Of the 17 units that comprised the Primrose, only 10 were filled. This lady had heard yelling coming from the apartment across the hall, a man with a deep voice and either a woman or a young child. The dispatchers immediately recognized the apartment number. Thaddeus Wheeler. Nunez and Rusty used the back entrance. Immediately, Nunez was overtaken by the smell, musty basement, and potpourri. Rusty didn't notice she headed straight for the elevators. Nunez looked to his right. Thaddeus Wheeler stood in the hallway, between the janitor's storage and the underused little closet where he liked to sleep. Rusty had already disappeared through the double doors. Nunez knew he should have gone after her, but he didn't want to give the kid the opportunity to sneak away. Thaddeus Wheeler was a very troubled little boy. He needed to be institutionalized. Not for hours under hold, long term. Until his bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, or whatever drove him to argue with himself and paint in his own blood, was sufficiently tamed by medication. Slowly, outstretched hands in full view of the boy, Nunez started down the hallway. Thaddeus smiled at him when he got close. "Hi, Officer Carlos," Thad said. "Have you figured it out yet?" "Figured what out?" Nunez asked conversationally. "What I am." Thad's smile grew wider, toothed and maniacal. The musty, sweet stench was suffocating. "Let me give you a hint," Thad said. Then his voice changed. It became monotonous, an alien mockery of a human voice. "This will all burn," Thad said, in red-headed corpse Michael's voice. "You will burn with it." Nunez backpedaled. The smell was intoxicating him, drowning him. Then he noticed Thad's bare arms, the arms that had been violently slashed up several weeks before with a serrated steak knife. There were no scars on those arms. "Wow, what?" Nunez sputtered. Thaddeus Wheeler, the thing that looked like Thaddeus Wheeler, laughed. "Bst, wrong answer," he boomed in a grown man's voice. "I am whatever the fuck I want to be." Then, lightning fast, he pulled open the closet door and vanished within. Burning adrenaline, Nunez followed. He found himself alone in an empty storage closet. The closet was, well, it wasn't what he'd been expecting. He didn't know what he had been expecting. It was a little room, maybe 10 feet by 12, with exposed concrete walls and 2 rickety shelves. A rusted lawnmower sat in one corner, and a pile of molding boxes filled with fluorescent light bulbs rested beside one of the shelves. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the stained linoleum floor was curling. He held his breath. He couldn't bear the smell. Where had Thaddeus gotten to? There was nowhere to hide. Behind him, he heard the door slam shut. He whirled, right hand instinctively reaching for his gun. Standing in front of him, between him and the door, was his grinning doppelganger. The man wore his uniform. Nunez recognized his own pointed nose, unshaven cheeks, and receding hairline. His deep brown eyes and untamed brows. He even stood the same way, feet apart, shoulders hunching forward, leaning on his right leg. The man was Officer Carlos Nunez, and he, like the real Nunez, was reaching for his gun. Not thinking, not feeling, operating solely on instinct, Nunez shot. 3 times. He heard the bullets hit. Pop, pop, pop. Then ringing in his ears, and then silence. He stood frozen, sweat-drenched hands threatening to drop his loaded weapon, trembling and drawing deep, ragged breaths. As the dust settled, he'd blown 3 holes through the flimsy wooden door. But again he found himself alone. He was a middle-aged officer of the law with years of experience, abandoning his partner and hiding in closets, shooting at figments of his imagination. Then there was a mighty crack, then a bang, then a scream, then more screams. He exited the room to the hallway and immediately found himself swept up in a minor exodus. Wild-eyed residents, scantily clad moms with kids, old couples in sweats, piled out of the stairways, fleeing for the exits. Nostrils now clear of the musty, sweet closet stench, Nunez smelled smoke. Then the alarms began blaring. "Fire!" screamed an emaciated middle-aged man running from the stairwell. Nunez screamed into his radio, insisting that dispatch send every available fire unit to the Primrose Apartments now. He ran up the stairs, crying the alarm, assisting old women with walkers, scooping up toddlers, herding the residents towards the safety of the evening air. When the last stragglers had been evacuated, Nunez surveyed the scene. In the distance, he heard sirens. Then he noticed the residents were all clustered around his same spot in the parking lot, too close to the burning building. A woman screamed. Nunez pushed his way through the throng. A body lay there, sprawled face down, blood pooling around what had been its head. The small, dark form was obviously dead. Spongy gray tissue had been splattered across the asphalt. He fell, someone said. Or he jumped. Poor little boy. His broken arms were extended, as though he'd embraced the sky. Then Nunez saw the scars on the shattered extremities, and he knew. It took until the early hours of the morning to extinguish the flames, and weeks to even begin cleaning up the mess. Ambulances came and left. 14 injuries in all. The burn unit at the county hospital must have had an interesting night. The uninjured residents, barred from returning to their apartments by the police and fire barricade, trudged to the bus stop or the waiting cars of sympathetic friends. Those with nowhere else to go milled around for hours. Finally, a church down the street agreed to take them in. Nunez saw Marisol and her sobbing son, shaking Dolores and stone-faced Michael. Then came the coroner's vans. When the ash had dissipated and the ruined building finally cooled, 9 bodies were recovered. One of them was Rusty. Another, Lydia Wheeler. Lydia had died of smoke inhalation in her room. It was never confirmed or denied, but whispered amongst the firefighters that she'd been locked in. A gas explosion had occurred in the kitchen of Lydia Wheeler's apartment. Little Thaddeus lit a match. He set his mother's couch on fire. He turned on the stove, and before the entire floor was engulfed in flames, he jumped out a window. Motives were thrown around. Finally, it was decided that the little boy was a paranoid schizophrenic, and the entire tragedy was a catastrophic side effect of his psychosis. Nunez had expected an ass-chewing, if not a suspension, for chasing specters while his partner was trapped in an inferno. So he was much surprised to be greeted as a hero. Some of the people he'd helped out of the building credited him with saving their lives. The human face of the tragedy, as presented by local newscasters, was Rochelle Crane, Thaddeus's older sister. She was lucky she'd been out of the apartment with her daughter and little brothers at the time, getting ice cream. Rochelle spoke kindly of Nunez, saying he and Rusty had been the only officers who'd cared about her poor, doomed sibling and Mott. My grandfather was an inventor. All his life he's been tinkering with something, either taking something that existed and changing it, making it into something brand new, or at the very least different, or inventing something entirely from spare parts. And while nothing he invented was ever earth-shaking, it was always one of my greatest delights, ever since I was a little girl, to see what he'd made. Childhood visits to his home would always begin or end with me sitting on the couch, a look of absolute fascination on my tiny face as he showed off whatever gadget he'd put together in his workshop this time around. It was like having my own personal Santa who worked all year round to fill my 8-year-old mind with wonder and glee. My older sister was likewise excited, no matter how much she tried to hide the excitement it filled her with, probably in an effort to appear cooler or more mature than myself. And while, because of real life getting in the way, the visits became fewer and fewer the older we got, we would always make time to see him at least a few times a year. And every time he would have something new to show us, he really was a genius. I should add that isn't meant to imply something horrible happened to him. I'm sure some days he wishes it had, that it had been him who had wound up in that hospital instead of my sister, but no, he went in his sleep, and I hope that his passing was a peaceful one. Even all these years later, I can't bring myself to be angry about what happened. Can't bring myself to hate him. He had no idea what would happen, no clue how things would pan out. He knew something was wrong, oh yes. He wasn't some doddering old fool. He knew the first time he looked through them that something was wrong, but he thought it was something only a little odd, something unsettling and curious perhaps, but not anything dangerous, not anything that would harm anyone. I think deep down he just wanted to know that he wasn't crazy. He wanted to be sure that he wasn't seeing things, and who can blame him? There were 3 of us that year, myself and my girlfriend Justine and my sister Joan. We were both used to our grandfather being bursting with energy to show us whatever he'd put together, so his oddly subdued mood when he came to the door to greet us came as a bit of a surprise. I was a little disappointed, in fact, as I'd been hoping Justine would get to share in the experience of having a new invention demonstrated before our awe-struck eyes. We'd only started dating that year, so it would be the first chance she got to see the kind of things I'd been telling her about. The day passed pleasantly enough as we chatted, enjoyed lunch, and watched the television together. I think it was Joan who asked him, finally, if he had anything special to show us today. We knew that he'd been working on something, as while this was the first time we'd seen him in person in a while, we'd both spoke to him on the phone in the preceding months, and he'd eagerly explained to us that he was working on something he thought would be quite extraordinary. I still couldn't tell you how he made them, nor would I if I could. Nor could I tell you what his original idea for those oddly colored circles of glass had been. Before that fateful day, he'd looked through them and seen what he'd seen. He never shared details of his work with us beforehand, as he wanted it to be a surprise. And afterwards, I think he was terrified of the thought of anyone replicating what he'd made. All I know is that when Joan pressed him to reveal his latest invention, he looked nervous in a way I'd never seen him before. Looked as if he was deeply troubled by something. He hesitated before speaking, as if not sure he should say anything at all, before explaining to us that the nature of what he was working on had changed after an unusual event, and that he wasn't sure if it would be a good idea to show us the end result. Now, we may have grown since the days when we could perch on his knee, but whether someone is 2 years old or in their 20s, the surest way to make them want something all the more is to tell them they can't have it. So his reluctance, which at the time I'm sure we both thought was feigned, to heighten the suspense before the unveiling, just made us both want to see his invention more than ever. With a little persuading, he agreed and left to fetch it. He came back a few moments later with what appeared to be a pair of glasses. With one big difference. The lenses were like no glass we'd ever seen before. I can't even describe the color of it without resorting to words like reddish or greeny, as they didn't seem to be exactly any color that we have a name for. In fact, they didn't seem to be exactly any one color at all, as if you tilted them one way they would look different to if you tilted them another. I know full well that probably sounds more like magic than something a well-meaning old man could put together in his humble little workshop, but there you have it. Joan asked what they did, and our grandfather paused for a few moments, as if not quite certain how to answer. In the end, he told us that we really had to put them on for ourselves, as he was certain neither of us would believe him if he told us. Joan wanted to put them on first, but as she lifted them off the table, he reached out and grabbed her hand. He cautioned her that it might be startling at first, but that she wasn't in any danger, and that if she got frightened she could just take them off. He warned her that what she was about to see may not make any more sense to her than it did to him, but that we were all there, and that she was safe. I could tell Joan was a little frightened. She always was lousy at hiding how she felt from people, and even I was feeling a bit unsettled by our grandfather being so uncharacteristically ominous about the whole thing. Joan slipped the glasses on and we waited. She gasped, and then for the next few moments she looked puzzled more than anything. Her lips moved wordlessly, and I thought I caught a "no, that's not right" under her breath, as she seemed to look around at something none of us could see. And then she began screaming. I don't know if you've ever heard someone scream in horror in real life. I can promise you this, it is not like in the movies. The movies do not convey the awful sound of someone you love screaming their lungs out, making a noise more like an animal than a human being. They cannot make you feel the things I felt in that moment, watching Joan yank the glasses from her head and hurl them across the room. And nothing could have prepared us for the sight of Joan beginning to claw at her own eyes, screaming louder than anyone should be able to scream as she did it. It took all three of us to restrain her at first. When we had her pinned down so she couldn't hurt herself anymore, Justine and my grandfather held her that way while I called for an ambulance. I had to watch as she was strapped down and wheeled into the back of one, thrashing and hissing and shrieking like some mad animal, like something utterly consumed by fear. I explained what had happened, knowing full well how it made me sound. Justine and I both explained the series of events that lead to this to the skeptical, if not totally disbelieving hospital staff, and then to the specialists called in when nothing short of being tranquilized proved effective at stopping my sister from trying to hurt herself while screaming like that. The glasses had supposedly gone missing, which made proving what had happened difficult, and it wasn't until almost a year later, long after my sister had been committed, that my grandfather finally confessed to me that he'd destroyed them. I don't know if having them could have helped, could have given the doctors some way to make things right. I doubt it somehow, and I can't truly blame him for doing what he did, given that it was an act born out of guilt and an honest desire to make sure this didn't happen again. I asked him what my sister had seen that day, when he told me what he'd done. I asked what those glasses had done to her. He hadn't wanted to talk about it, and for the first time in my life I'd raised my voice to him, angrily demanding to know, after all this time, just what had driven my sister to this state, what had affected her so deeply, so profoundly that she was now no longer even recognizable as the person I'd grown up with. He took me to his workshop and began digging around through the bits and pieces that littered the place, the half-finished and now long-discarded inventions still awaiting completion. He produced 2 pieces of glass rather like the ones that had been fitted into those glasses. He told me that there wasn't any way to describe it without sounding insane, that if I had to know, then I had to see. But he begged me not to do this, that knowing wouldn't make things any better. He was right. I held the glass up to my eyes, and in an instant, everything changed. Instead of just my grandfather stood before me, now there were dozens more in the room with us. But they weren't people. They were pale and emaciated, hunched over and dressed in dark clothing with black lips and wide lidless eyes that seemed to almost bulge from their skulls in a manner both comical and horrifying all at once. Their mouths were full of hundreds of thin teeth, like needles. Their fingers were grotesquely long and ended in dark and viciously pointed nails that scraped along the floor as they walked. And all of them were talking, or rather their lips were moving soundlessly. Each and every one of them was trying to say something that couldn't be heard. Dozens upon dozens of voices trying to convey something. I dropped the glasses to the ground in shock, and my grandfather brought his foot down on them hard, grinding them to powder beneath his foot, muttering that he should have done this in the first place. He put an arm on my shoulder, asking if I was all right. I was far from all right, and he had been correct. What I had seen had made things worse, not better. It took me a while to work it out, of course. Why this had such a horrifying effect on my sister, and yet I had survived the experience. Frightened, but not sporting the mental scars it had given her. The glasses only let me see the creatures. I couldn't hear what they were trying to say to me, couldn't understand the message they were trying to impart, but my sister was deaf. She could read their lips. 2. Jeremy Fuentes, PhD Professor of Cultural Anthropology, University of California, Berkeley. Jeremy, I assume you have heard about the strange discovery made at R&D Street, a converted warehouse located on the corner of R&D and Weller Avenue, in the middle of the Arts District in downtown Los Angeles. The building is currently undergoing renovations. 3 weeks ago, construction workers noted a foul odor wafting through the property, coming from behind what they had thought was a solid brick wall. But, upon further investigation, it was discovered that the inside measurements of the property did not match up with the outside. There was, in fact, a 25 times 30 fort space on the first floor completely overlooked. A secret room, so to speak, one inaccessible from any point inside the building or out. It was located at the far end of the property, along the wall forming the west side of Weller. With permission, the workers broke through the wall to access the otherwise inaccessible area. Immediately, they were floored by the overpowering stench of rotting meat. Bandanas over their noses, they entered the enclosure. Inside, they found a nice M&M camera, smashed to bits. They found film equipment, all destroyed, cracked lights, torn screens, metal light stands folded like paper clips. Cheap-looking, framed paintings and kitschy prop menus scattered like confetti. And 3 bodies, 3 decomposing bodies, in a state too disturbing for description, though the term half-eaten has been thrown around. How the equipment or the corpses ended up there has yet to be determined. Neither the walls nor the ceiling were disturbed at any point, and there was no sign of tunneling under the 4-foot-thick concrete floor. No, one can explain how 3 dead people and a bunch of film paraphernalia magically appeared within a completely walled-off space. But it was all the more shocking for me, personally, due to the contents of a handwritten letter left for me by a former patient of mine. Her name was Catherine Sue. She voluntarily checked herself into the Marsdale Psychiatric Treatment Center, where I am an on-call physician, several months ago, and was discharged shortly before the horrific discovery at R&D Street. I am no longer in contact with the young woman. However, I believe you will find her testimony, a transcript of which I have enclosed, very intriguing. Sincerely, Larry Scher, MD. Testimony of Katie Sue, Marsdale Psychiatric Hospital. Just for the record, shooting Bella Cardone's movie at the Three Friends Diner wasn't my idea. I told her it was a scam, that no restaurateur in Los Angeles with 2 brain cells to rub together would have possibly charged us so little for a location so photogenic. Again and again, I insisted it just felt wrong. I was right. I used to like being right. A little backstory. I'm Katie. I'm years old. I used to be a junior at Cal State Northridge, studying business administration and film production. I enjoyed the phone calls and the organizing and the paperwork filling that most film students hate, and had built up a modest reputation as a pre-production guru amongst my classmates, as well as with friends and acquaintances who attended other schools. Bella Cardone was one of such acquaintances, a year-old international student from Italy I'd met at a third-rate horror film festival. She'd been employed at a television station in Rome doing something, but dreamed of writing and directing Hollywood movies. She was one of a dozen or so, mostly foreign, enrollees a year and a half into the 2-year master's program at New York Film Academy. She was writing her thesis script at the time and asked me to help organize the production of the short film. Her script was about a starving artist working as a waitress who gets dumped by her boyfriend, then has an existential breakdown in which she imagines herself poisoning her customers and getting tortured, culminating with a series of flash cuts in which she simultaneously slashes her wrists and drowns in the ocean. Typical pretentious grad student fare. We needed to lock down 5 locations: an apartment, a beach, a park, something that could function as a dungeon and a restaurant. The beach and the park were relatively easy, and a classmate of Bella's agreed to let us use her North Hollywood apartment for 2 days. Another classmate, a quiet little guy named Sandeep, discreetly told me about an Samp M store with a basement dungeon they infrequently rented out for movie shoots. I don't know how he came to be so familiar with such an establishment, and I'm not sure I want to know, but it proved ideal for our purposes, which left the restaurant, a notoriously difficult one for students and independent filmmakers. So when I found a little French place in Encino on Craigslist, got in touch with the manager, and played the broke student card so well he granted us use of his restaurant for a night for a little over, I was ready to sign the papers, get the permit, and move on. It was 2 weeks before Bella's scheduled first day of shooting, and I had a million other things to worry about, from liability insurance, to catering, to talking Northridge underclassmen into helping out as Gamp, E-Crew, and Paz. Bella, however, thought for a night was too expensive, and remained convinced she could find a better deal. So she went on Craigslist herself, and placed a restaurant wanted for student film ad. But I'd put up a similar posting 3 weeks earlier. That's how I found the French place in Encino, and Bella received the exact same responses from the exact same people, with one exception, an email from gsjegpdd@com, which she forwarded to me. It read like this: "Kleep locked in for film students, restaurant in downtown Los Angeles, Weller Ave, FR Day. RSPND to this email will send you key pay on DT of filming. MS to B Dec MBRRD afternoon." I was suspicious immediately, for a day of filming seemed a little too good to be true. Then there was the poor spelling and lack of contact information, and the fact that when I tried to respond to the email, all I got was an error message. And then there was the key. The key turned up in Bella's on-campus mailbox 2 days after the email, enclosed in a stained brown envelope with no return address. And as if that wasn't creepy enough, it came with a scrawled note: "Key to 3 friends' dinner." I was ready to call it a scam and be done with it, but Bella thought we should at least check the place out. If it was real, she argued, it was too good a deal to pass up. Movies are expensive, and we were already pushing her budget. So I agreed to go with her and Hamed Shirazi, the cinematographer, to 35 Weller Avenue, which it turned out was in the middle of the Arts District. I have a love-hate relationship with the Arts District. It's a cool place to meet a friend at her new loft. There are some nice restaurants and amusing wall art, and the dissonance created by graffiti-coated trash cans, barbed wire, and long smelly lines outside the social services building sharing a block with yoga studios, BMWs, and boutique gift shops hawking $80 vintage baby sweaters is ironically poetic. But the streets are one way, and parking is non-existent. I drove in a triangle for 15 minutes before surrendering and pulling into a flat-rate lot. Weller Avenue wasn't a street so much as a glorified driveway, a short, narrow alley that branched off of R&D Street and dead-ended. A large L-shaped building occupied the east and north sides of Weller. It appeared to be a closed nightclub in the process of being converted into an art gallery. The blacked-out windows were covered with torn, dirty stickers advertising shows long since played, and bands long since broken up, and graffiti artists, the gang-affiliated kind, not the Arts Foundation kind, had their way with both the seafoam green walls and the ratty trash dumpster abandoned in the corner. The gray brick warehouse that functioned as the west side of Weller, R&D Street, looked completely unoccupied. A sign hung in a window. The building had apparently been bought by East River Development. I recognized the name. My realtor father knew some people who worked for that company. They bought old commercial properties and converted them into trendy, pricey apartments. The most prominent visual, however, was the mural painted on the north wall. It depicted the head and chest of a woman, face tilted eastward. The woman had tan skin, ruby red lips, and flowing hair in varying shades of blue, periwinkle at the tips, darkening to deep lavender at her scalp. Her eyes were closed. In the background, some distance behind her, was what appeared to be an orange grove. It was a beautiful painting, and strangely mesmerizing. If you looked at the woman one way, she seemed young and innocent, sporting a demure grin. Then, if you cocked your head, or blinked, lines appeared on her cheeks, and her lips rearranged themselves into a pouty sneer. I saw only one door on Weller, leading into the gray building. It was a very shabby door of splintery, untreated wood, with a rusting doorknob and keyhole. No business name, no street number. This couldn't possibly be the restaurant from Craigslist, Three Friends Diner, I guess it was called. How did anyone ever find the place? I was still puzzling when Bella and Hamed found me. Bloody hell, Hamed barked in lieu of a greeting. Where's the restaurant? Here, according to my phone, I said. I'm willing to bet money someone is fucking with us. Bella didn't seem too concerned. Her eyes were fixed on the mural. So pretty, she exclaimed. Can we film? I shrugged. I'm not sure. We might run into some copyright issues. And it doesn't look like we're going to be filming here at all, since we're not looking at a restaurant. Bella frowned at me and took the key out of her purse. She walked up to the wooden door. Here? She asked. I don't think so, I said. There's no sign or anything. I mean, you can try it, but I'm really doubting that key is going to fit into that. Bella turned the key and pulled at the knob. With a creak, the door opened. Hamed and I rushed to her, and together, we stepped inside. Hamed scrambled for a light switch, and then the room was illuminated by a warm golden glow. We found ourselves staring at Three Friends Diner. It was perfect. It was a larger space than I'd thought it would be, rectangular shaped, the kitchen jutting out from the north wall. Behind the kitchen was a small corridor leading to the bathroom and a closet that could function as dry storage. The walls were painted that particular shade of deep red that looks beautiful on film, and the tables and chairs and diner-style booths were a nice contrast in black and gray. And each table was adorned with a salt and pepper shaker, an empty bottle of ketchup, and a vase of plastic lilies. Don't get too excited yet, I said to Hamed, who was examining one of the series of stained glass lamps from which light was emanating. We don't know how much juice you've got to work with. That's the beauty of it, he said gleefully. I don't even need that much juice. If we come a bit early and switch out all these bulbs, I can use the lamps as practicals. Plus, this place obviously isn't open yet, which means I'm not sharing power with anything. He was right about that. The freezers and refrigerators were unplugged, the storage closet was empty, and there wasn't a plate, or a cup, or a scrap of food to be found. It was definitely a new restaurant, the latest in an avalanche of trendy urban eateries inundating the arts district as the neighborhood gentrified. Of course it was hard to find. That would lend an air of mystery to the diner, foster the impression of exclusivity, attract a Twitter following. I love it, Bella announced. Can you get a permit? I tried to talk her out of it. Something about Three Friends Diner made me nervous, made the little hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But it was exactly what Bella had been looking for, and Hamed had already started planning shots, and the little hairs on the back of my neck didn't stand a chance against cheap, gorgeous, and logistically ideal. The restaurant wasn't open yet, which meant we could shoot during the day, decorate how we wanted, and place the camera anywhere without worrying about being in anyone's way. And December R&D, the date the mysterious proprietors had insisted on, was our scheduled theft day of shooting. Don't look under the horse you get, Bella told me. I think she meant, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. That saying is a reference to the Trojan horse, given as a token of surrender by the Greeks during the Trojan War. I don't know why people keep repeating it, because if the Trojans had looked into that horse's wooden mouth, the Iliad might have ended differently. As I said before, I'd been forced to park in a $10 lot, and of course, the attendant's iPhone was malfunctioning, so I couldn't pay with my card. I had no cash. The attendant directed me to a convenience store on Alameda that apparently had an ATM. I wasn't thrilled. It was getting dark, and a trendy neighborhood 6 blocks from Skid Row is still a trendy neighborhood 6 blocks from Skid Row. The convenience store stuck out like a gold tooth, a little scrap of what the neighborhood used to be, wedged between a cafe and a construction site. A cracked neon sign branded it Alameda Mart. The ice cream fridge was stuffed with La Michoacana popsicles, and the cash register sat behind a pane of bulletproof glass. I engaged in battle what must have been the slowest ATM known to man, and was mentally cursing the loading screen when I became aware of the sole other customer in the shop. "Need to pay for parking?" he asked. I turned. The man standing behind me was obviously homeless. He wore grime-caked jeans and a stained military service jacket, and his leathery face demonstrated the dullness of days with no soap. I nodded and smiled. "You a tourist?" I shook my head. "Student filmmaker, actually. My friend's going to shoot at this restaurant on Weller." Immediately, I doubted the wisdom of sharing this piece of information. I didn't want him to show up and beg for change, but his unshaven face fell, and his tone became one of alarm rather than anticipation. "There's no restaurant on Weller," he murmured. "There's just Bessie." I giggled. "Bessie?" He nodded. "That's what folks around here call her. The old folks say she can change things, make things appear, and disappear." He leaned in, narrowed his eyes, and dropped his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "If I was you, I'd stay away. They say every 20 years, for one day, Bessie comes corporeal and feeds." I would have asked him to elaborate, to explain exactly who Bessie was and why I should be afraid, but right then the shop proprietor noticed the homeless man and yelled at him what I'd assumed were not nice words in Spanish. He booked it, and by the time the ATM coughed up my cash and I was back on Alameda, he'd disappeared. On the way to the car lot, I passed Weller. The blue-haired girl was right where I'd left her, standing in front of a grove of trees in 3/4 profile, facing westward towards the door of the Three Friends diner, eyes closed. Was she Bessie? Then fear washed over me like a cold shower, and I ran. I threw a 20 at the parking attendant and got out of there as fast as I could. Something about that mural had scared the shit out of my subconscious. Halfway to the freeway, I figured it out. She, Bessie, was facing the wrong way. Bella's first 5 days of filming went delightfully well. So well that, when I arrived at Three Friends Diner for the 6th and final day, December 3rd, I forgot I was scared of the place. Crew call was 1. Hamed had already been there for an hour, switching out light bulbs and unloading equipment with Esteban the gaffer and 2 grips, Miguel and Andrea. Our grip truck was parked out front, partially obstructing my view of the mural, but I could tell that Bessie was facing eastwards, towards the club-turned-gallery, as she had been the first time I saw her. Of course, it had been dark that night, and I'd been scared and alone. I'd seen things that weren't really there. I made my way through the obstacle course of lights and C-stands, set up my iPad at an unused table, and worked on the equipment drop-off schedule as crew members filtered in. I heard Katya's voice at least a minute before she and Bella walked through the door. God, that chick was loud. Bossy, too. No wonder she was such a good assistant director. Then came Venna, the production designer, carrying a large box of prop house framed pictures and the menus she'd designed. Nairi, the first camera assistant, set up the area while her lackey du jour loaded film. Then 2 more grips, Pete and Ryan, Kaylee and Michelle, the freshman pause, Lisa, the script supervisor, Dante, the sound guy, and finally Ming, the makeup artist. Then the actors came, and then Hamed and the guys were setting up lights for the master shot, and then Katya was calling for last looks, and then we were pushing in for close-ups. The first 4 hours went as smoothly and productively as we had any right to expect, and for a short time, we entertained the possibility of finishing early. We were an hour ahead of schedule when we broke for lunch, everyone talking and laughing and enjoying themselves. That's when things started getting weird. Right after lunch, as we were picking ourselves up and resuming our work, one of the freshmen paused. Michelle went to use the restroom. A minute later, there was a blood-curdling scream. Ryan dropped a C-stand. Nairi nearly dropped a lens. Hamed and Esteban took frantic steps towards the bathrooms as Michelle sprinted down the hall back towards us. "Who the fuck was in the storage closet?" she cried. We all looked at each other. "Seriously," Michelle demanded. "This isn't funny. You fucking knocked me over." "Michelle?" Katya asked. "What are you talking about?" Michelle was trembling. She looked ready to cry. "I went to the bathroom," she said, "and I heard this thumping coming from the closet that's back there. Someone was pounding on the door." "We didn't hear anything," Hamed said. "Someone was like ramming against the door," Michelle repeated. "And so I opened it. And someone ran right into me, then ran towards you guys," she sobbed. Hamed narrowed his eyes. "You sure, Michelle? Because we were all out here, and no one came running from the bathrooms." "He was wearing a black hoodie," Michelle insisted. "I looked over the dining room to see if anyone was missing. Nope. 17 crew members, 4 actors, none of whom was wearing a black hoodie, all inside a restaurant with only one entrance." "You didn't see who it was?" I asked Michelle rather stupidly. Obviously not, she shouted. It happened really fast. I just saw the black hoodie and really pale, really white skin. We couldn't solve the mystery. Michelle was pretty shaken up. One of the grips, Miguel, offered to drive her back to Northridge. He said he had to go too, because he had afternoon classes. But it was hard to miss the tremble in his voice or the dampness of his palms. And suddenly, Kaylee, the other Pa, also had classes she'd forgotten to mention, and tagged along with them back to campus. 3 hours after that incident, we set up for our last shot in the dining area before moving to the kitchen, though we'd come to the unspoken agreement that Michelle was either looking for attention or smoking pot in the bathroom. Everyone was a little bit on edge, and it had slowed us down. To speed things up, I offered to help Venna dress the kitchen. She'd brought cutting boards, utensils, bread, lunch meat, and enough restaurant necessities to make the empty kitchen look like a busy back of house. At one point, she ran to her car to fetch some plates she'd bought from the Sense store. I was arranging knives on a knife block. I accidentally dropped one. It skidded across the floor and got stuck under one of the large industrial refrigerators. I knelt down and reached under the refrigerator to grab it. As I did, I heard a creak behind me, a door opening on stubborn hinges. I straightened up and turned around, still on my knees. A blast of cold air hit me in the face. I was staring into an open freezer, ice caked on the back of the door and the walls. There were bodies in the freezer, old decomposing bodies, wrinkled leathery skin peeling off yellowed bones. Bones that were oddly compromised, shattered, pulverized. Greenish mold clinging to the remains of brain matter cradled in cracked skulls. The putrescent smell of rotting flesh. I closed my eyes and screamed. And screamed and screamed and screamed. "Katie, what the fuck, Katie?" I heard Hamed's voice, felt his hand on my arm shaking me. I opened my eyes. The freezer was empty and turned off. I looked up to see Bella and Venna standing over me. The rest of the crew was crowded around the kitchen entrance or watching through the window that separated it from the dining room. "Sorry, guys," I stammered, heart still racing. I thought I saw a rat. Did I ruin the shot?" Haim shook his head. "We're done. You sure you're okay?" I nodded. Can I talk to you and Bella and Katya outside?" The three muttered agreement, and we made our way across the dining room and out the door as the rest of the crew set up lights in the kitchen. I had to tell them. We had to leave. Now, something, was trying to impress on us we weren't welcome. I thought I saw dead things in that freezer, I started, quite pathetically. It was on, and it was cold, and there was this smell. Bella's eyes widened. Hamd cocked his head, frowning. Katya crossed her arms. I continued, I know it was just a hallucination, but it felt so real, and I'm not schizophrenic. And the thing with Michelle and I think we should leave. There's something really wrong going on here. I'd expected them to laugh at me or to treat me like a patient in a psych ward. They did neither. "Yeah, this place is starting to creep me out too," Hamed said. "For starters, where are the bloody owners? Who hands a stranger the key to their business? Either they're mental or they've got some ulterior motive." He lowered his voice. "And I'm getting these sensations, like somebody's watching us." Bella and Katya nodded in agreement, concern in their eyes. They'd felt it too. "We can find another restaurant," I told Bella. "All we need is the kitchen. We can easily cheat that, make it look like it's the same place." "I'll do whatever you want me to do," Hamed said to her. "But I think we should consider packing up early." Bella looked at Katya, then Hamed, then me. Her expression softened for a second, then she set her jaw. "We wait 1 hour," she said. "No problems, we film." We decided not to tell the crew and the one remaining actress about the agreement we'd come to, fearing they'd panic and make a big deal out of what could have been nothing more than the effect of darkness on a big city. But several of them were undeniably scared and looking for an excuse to leave. As soon as the four of us walked back through the door, Nairi and the nameless NDAC walked out. "We were too immature for them," Nairi told Katya. Dante, the sound guy, asked Bella if he could head out early, since we didn't need any sync sound for the kitchen scene. 2 hours earlier, he'd insisted on staying around for the sole purpose of getting various kitchen sounds. And when the lights were set, and the blocking was rehearsed, and last looks were called for, we found that Ming, the makeup artist, had quietly packed up her kit and left. No big loss. The actress was perfectly capable of applying the simple makeup design herself. Pete, one of the grips, was fairly adept at pulling focus, and Hamed conscripted me to hold the slate. and our agreed-upon hour had passed with no new unexplained phenomena. Finally, Hamed flipped the camera on, and Bella called action. The actress unenthusiastically smeared mayo onto bread, stacked lunch meat and lettuce, then smiled evilly. She turned to grab the poisonous cleaning solution from under the sink, and then the lights all went off. Somewhere in the pitch blackness, someone shrieked. There was a bump and a thud, and then the dining room lamps came on. Esteban had found the switch. "Someone ran by me," Lisa cried. "Who brushed against me?" "It couldn't be an outage," Hamed said to one of the grips. "The house lights work fine." "Seriously," Lisa sobbed. "Who the fuck pushed me?" "Hey," Esteban yelled. "Guys!" We all shoved our way into the dining room. The grip crew had plugged the 5 lights we were using for the kitchen scenes into 5 different electrical outlets amongst the tables. The power cables were spread out, lying across the carpet like a spider web, so as not to draw too much electricity from any one spot. Every cable had been severed, sliced down the middle, perfect, clean cuts, as though accomplished with a sharp knife. "Who the fuck did that?" Katya snapped, trying and failing to disguise her distress, because she knew all 10 crew members had been in the kitchen, and that no one person could have cut all 5 cables at exactly the same time. "Everybody out," Hamed demanded. "Now!" Nobody needed to be told twice. We pushed through the wooden door and convened on the sidewalk, under the closed eyes of the blue-haired mural girl. The Northridge students huddled together. Katya paced, Venna glared with her arms crossed, and Bella attempted to regain control over her compromised film set. "We cannot leave equipment," she told anyone who bothered to listen. "Forget this shit," Venna sneered. "I'm leaving." She stormed off. The actress threw Bella a helpless look, mumbled, "Call me," and started after Venna. I looked to the 4 remaining Northridge underclassmen, Andrea, Lisa, Pete, and Ryan. "Miguel was going to give us a ride," Ryan said. "I took the bus," Lisa stammered. "Take them home," Hamed said to me. "I'll stay and help Bella pack up." "I can stay too," Katya said. Esteban nodded at them. "Okay, cool," I said. "I'll come back and help you guys finish up after I drop them off. Give me an hour and a half." No one spoke the entire way back to campus. The silence was punctuated only by Lisa's occasional sob. Andrea reached over and spun the radio dial to some top station, then almost immediately turned it off. The 2 guys stared out their respective windows. I left them outside the dorms, turned my car around, and headed back towards I couldn't wrap my head around what I had just experienced. Some esoteric party had lured us to 3 Friends Diner, left a key with a group of complete strangers, demanded we film today, the 3rd, then hadn't bothered to show up and collect the suspiciously unsubstantial amount they'd asked as payment. Why? To mess with us? Were we on some kind of hidden camera show? Was there a trapdoor we didn't know about? Maybe there'd been a projector hidden in the kitchen, creating the disturbing image of dead, decomposing corpses in the freezer. But how to explain the smell? Or the cold? Or the hooded specter that had produced loud knocks behind the storage closet door that only Michelle could hear? On to explanation B. We'd become victims of the creature the homeless man had called Bessie. She was a ghost or a demon, and we were trespassers on her property. Then why not start with the big stunt? The severed cables. Why the systematic approach, scaring one person at a time? And this poltergeist theory didn't explain who'd led us to the 3 Friends Diner, or why. Led us there, to scare us away. 3 Friends Diner. As I merged onto the 4 minutes after midnight, I figured it out. One hand on the wheel, I called Bella 3 times, then Haim twice, then Katya, then Esteban. Every single time, I was sent directly to voicemail. I left messages for them, pleading, screaming messages, begging them to forget the equipment and run far, far away. Then I called and sobbed to the dispatcher that my friends were in grave danger at Weller Avenue. She calmly assured me that help would be there in minutes. I got there first. The street lights up and down the block had at some point gone out, so I found my way to Weller Avenue with only my phone and the moonlight to guide me. The dim bluish beam cast by my cell phone fell on the seafoam green east wall, then the open and half-loaded grip truck, and finally on Hamed. He lay crumpled on the asphalt, a pool of dark liquid expanding around him. I ran to him, screaming his name over and over. He didn't respond. I saw his chest rise and fall feebly as I knelt beside him and felt a faint carotid pulse. I rolled him onto his back. There was a large cut on the side of his head. His hair was matted with blood. His left arm hung at an odd angle, but the most distressing injury he'd acquired, and the one responsible for most of the blood, was a series of 5 deep lacerations into his right bicep. The muscle was torn, and shattered bone was visible through the mess of ribboned skin and ground meat fatty tissue. The positioning of the lacerations was consistent with the placement of 5 fingers, latched onto his upper arm. 5 fingers with very long, very sharp claws. I tore off my jacket and tied it around his arm like a tourniquet. My consciousness had kicked into overdrive. I operated on quick flashes of disconnected logic. Something had attacked Hamed. It was gone. It was gone. Bella, Katya, Esteban, where the fuck were they? I stood up. Help was on the way, and there wasn't a whole lot I could do for Hamed until the paramedics got there. But the rest of them were still in the Three Friends diner, and if I'd guessed right, I ran to the door. But the door wasn't there. I was staring at a gray, unbroken wall. I dashed to the corner of the dead end, and then to the sidewalk, scouring the length of the wall with my phone. I ran back and forth again and again, feeling the bricks with my fingers. Nothing. The one entrance to the Three Friends diner was just gone. The streetlights came back on. My terrifying impression was confirmed. I was on Weller. I was facing the right way, but there was no door. In the distance, I thought I heard sirens. I looked up at the mural, the pretty blue-haired girl with closed eyes, standing in front of a citrus grove. She was gone too. In her place was a shriveled old woman, skin dotted with sickeningly detailed moles and age spots. Her hair was the filthy, stringy, disheveled mane of a homeless woman. Her open mouth took up the entire length of her cheeks, showing off black, rotten, knife-like teeth, dripping blood. A lot of blood. Blood that ran down the seafoam green wall like rainwater, pooling on the asphalt below. Her eyes were open, her bloodshot, yellow eyes, her dilated pupils flashing maniacally, those bulging, staring, impossibly detailed eyes. This was no spray paint. Her eyes were real. Then her foot-long pupils shifted, and I swore her fanged smile grew even wider. She was looking at me. This was Bessie. I don't remember the cops showing up, or the fire truck, or the paramedics. I didn't notice them lifting Hamed onto a gurney, or loading him into an ambulance. And I have no recollection of the back of the second ambulance, or the psych ER, or the questions I answered for the doctors, or the drugs. All I know is that I woke up 23 hours later, in the tiny detox room of the private mental hospital my parents had me transferred to. I stayed there for the remaining hours I was under hold, then went home to La Crescenta with my family. The last I heard, Hamed had regained consciousness and could speak short words like hi or yes. This is a good sign. The brain damage may be less severe than the doctors initially thought. His memory's shot, of course. He can't remember traveling to America, much less what transpired the night he sustained his injuries. He was lucky, if such a word can possibly apply to his situation, that his left shoulder had take.